The sports world is about to get flipped upside down. Not gradually, not over years of slow change. We're talking about a single deal. One conversation, one check that could permanently redraw the map of women's basketball forever. And the crazy part, the people who were supposed to prevent this were too busy being petty to see it coming. There's a number floating around right now that doesn't feel real. $1 billion. That's not a contract extension. That's not a shoe deal. That's not a signing bonus buried in fine print. That is a full-scale hostile acquisition of the most valuable asset women's sports has ever produced. And according to reports circulating across the sports media landscape, reports that Stephen A. Smith himself addressed on live national television, the Saudi Public Investment Fund has Caitlin Clark in their crosshairs, not as a player, as a franchise, as an empire. And they want Sophie Cunningham standing right next to her when they build it. The WNBA had every opportunity to make this moment impossible. Instead, they handed the Saudis the blueprint, the motivation, and the open door. What happens next will define women's basketball for the next 50 years, and the league has nobody to blame but itself. Before we get into the billion-dollar offer, we need to sit with the number that made it inevitable: $76,000. That's what Caitlin Clark earned in her first year as a professional basketball player. $76,000 for the woman who single-handedly dragged the WNBA out of a 27-year financial hole and placed it directly in front of millions of brand-new eyeballs. Let that sink in for a second. There are NBA players, guys who ride the bench and see 12 minutes of action on a good night, who earned that same amount every single week. Some of them earn it in 4 days. Meanwhile, Clark signed a 4-year rookie contract worth roughly $338,000 total, and the league acted like they were doing her a favor. Now, here's the part that makes this even more absurd. The WNBA's standard defense for years has been a simple one: we don't have the revenue. For nearly 2 decades, the league operated in the red, losses every year. The argument was always that the money simply wasn't there to pay players what they deserved. Fine, that was the reality. Until Caitlin Clark showed up and dismantled that reality in about 90 days. From the moment she was drafted, attendance figures went vertical. Arenas that were half empty the previous season suddenly had waiting lists. Television viewership shattered records that had been sitting untouched for decades. Jersey sales, her jerseys specifically, were moving at numbers the league had never seen from any player in its entire history. Sponsors came flooding in. Media coverage exploded. The Caitlin Clark effect wasn't a theory, it was a financial transformation, documented in real time, in real dollars, by every metric the league tracks. She was generating millions, tens of millions, and in exchange, she was taking home a check that barely covers rent in Indianapolis, let alone the financial pressure that comes with being the face of an entire sport. This wasn't just unfair, it was the kind of structural imbalance that doesn't stay quiet forever. Eventually, someone with enough money shows up and offers a correction, and the Saudi Public Investment Fund doesn't deal in corrections, they deal in revolutions. If you want to understand why this story is gaining real traction and not just fading into the noise of sports media speculation, you need to pay attention to who is talking about it and what they're actually saying. Stephen A. Smith didn't just mention the Saudi rumors in passing, he leaned into them. He confirmed their credibility on national television, and more importantly, he didn't frame it as something that might happen. He framed it as something that the WNBA had already made inevitable. Smith has been the loudest, most consistent voice calling out the league's treatment of Clark since day one. While other analysts were tiptoeing around the subject, trying to frame what was happening as competitive spirit or league growing pains, Smith was on air calling it exactly what it was: jealousy, mismanagement, and institutional failure at the highest level. He called out the Kennedy Carter incident. He called out the fact that Clark was traveling commercial while the league's infrastructure treated its biggest star like any other rookie. He called out her exclusion from the Olympic squad, despite being arguably the most recognizable women's basketball player on the planet.
But here's what shifted. His earlier commentary was criticism, frustration, a loud voice demanding better. His recent statements are something different. They read less like a sports analyst venting and more like a warning from someone who knows something. The market always corrects itself. That's what he said. He made it clear that a league paying someone $76,000 a year while she drives hundreds of millions in value cannot hold on to that person indefinitely. Not in today's sports landscape, not when other money exists. And then, instead of walking back the Saudi speculation the way analysts typically do when a rumor crosses into uncomfortable territory, instead of calling it noise or clickbait, Smith let it breathe. He added fuel. In the world of sports media, when someone of Smith's credibility and platform chooses to amplify a rumor rather than dismiss it, that's not an accident. He knows things, and what he's signaling right now is that the WNBA is standing at the edge of a cliff it built for itself, one bad decision at a time. The loyalty argument, as Smith put it, collapses completely when disrespect becomes the norm. He essentially told the world she was treated like an enemy by the people she was supposed to play alongside, and now she might become their competitor instead. That's not just commentary, that's a prophecy being written in real time. Let's be clear about what we know and what we don't. The $1 billion figure and the reported targeting of Clark and Cunningham by the Saudi Public Investment Fund are, as of now, in the realm of speculation and reports from sports media insiders. Nothing has been officially confirmed, no press conference has happened, no contract has been publicly signed. But the shape of what's being described, the structure of what this deal reportedly looks like, is specific enough that it's worth understanding in detail, because it's not a simple salary offer, it's an entirely different model. Reports suggest this isn't about luring Clark into a side league with better pay. The vision, according to what's being circulated, is a complete reimagining of how women's professional basketball is packaged and sold to the world. Think less like a traditional city-based sports franchise and more like what LIV Golf became after the Saudis got involved, a tour model. A global, high-stakes, event-driven format where the biggest names travel to the biggest cities, London, Dubai, Tokyo, New York, and compete in premium televised tournaments that are designed to be spectacles first and basketball games second. No grinding 40-game regular season where half the games are played in 3,000 people. No commercial flights across time zones, no salary cap squeezing generational talent into entry-level earnings. The reported offer would replace all of that with something that doesn't currently exist in women's sports: genuine superstar infrastructure, luxury travel, upfront capital that, if the $1 billion figure is accurate, would represent more money than every other WNBA player in the league's history has collectively earned. For Clark specifically, what's being described isn't a paycheck, it's an empire. She would not be an employee of this new structure, she would be a cornerstone of it, a stakeholder with the kind of leverage that the WNBA's salary cap system makes structurally impossible. And that's the point. The Saudis aren't trying to compete with the WNBA on the WNBA's terms. They're trying to make the WNBA irrelevant by building something so different, so better resourced, and so centered around the players who actually drive viewership that comparison becomes uncomfortable. Whether every detail of this reported structure is accurate, we can't say for certain, but the framework is coherent. It follows a pattern that has already worked once before. And that pattern has a name. Here's the thing about the Saudi investment strategy in sports. It isn't experimental anymore. It's a proven model with a documented track record, and anyone who thinks women's basketball is immune to it hasn't been paying attention. Cast your mind back to the PGA Tour a few years ago. Golf had one dominant structure. The PGA Tour controlled the players, the schedules, the prize money, and the narrative. Guys like Mickelson and Dustin Johnson were locked into a system that, for all its prestige, had a ceiling.
Then the Saudi Public Investment Fund showed up, not as a partner, not as a sponsor, but as a disruptor. They didn't ask permission. They didn't negotiate with the PGA Tour's leadership. They went directly to the players and made offers that the existing system simply couldn't match. Mickelson took the money, Dustin took the money, a wave of tour players followed. The sports media went ballistic. Critics screamed about sports washing, about human rights records, about the ethics of taking Saudi dollars. The backlash was intense and immediate. And then, slowly, inevitably, it became background noise, because the golf was still happening. The players were still elite, the tournaments were still competitive, and fans ultimately watch players, not institutions.
The PGA Tour eventually had to sit down at the table they'd been refusing to acknowledge. The leverage had shifted entirely. The Saudis hadn't beaten the PGA Tour in a negotiation. They'd made negotiation the only option by removing the alternative. Now look at the WNBA's situation and tell me with a straight face that it isn't the same setup. A league with underpaid players, poor travel conditions, institutional dysfunction, and a roster of disgruntled veterans who've been vocal about their frustrations for years. A star player whose market value is in another galaxy compared to what the league compensates her. An outside investor with essentially unlimited capital and a pattern of targeting exactly these kinds of structural mismatches. The WNBA isn't just vulnerable to the LIV Golf playbook, it might be the perfect target for it. Every variable lines up, and the Saudis don't miss variables. When rumors first surfaced that Sophie Cunningham was the second name on the Saudi target list alongside Clark, a lot of people raised an eyebrow. Why not Breanna Stewart? Why not A'ja Wilson? Both are multiple-time MVPs. Both are globally recognized. Both have championship pedigrees that Cunningham doesn't match on paper. The answer reveals exactly how sophisticated this reported strategy actually is. It isn't about assembling the most decorated roster in women's basketball. It's about building a product that sells to audiences who don't already watch the WNBA. Stewart and Wilson are names that hardcore fans know deeply and love genuinely. Cunningham is something different. She's a personality. She's a brand. She's someone who reaches an audience that hasn't traditionally engaged with women's professional basketball and makes them feel like they're missing something. Her social media presence is significant, her image is distinct, and her combination of physical toughness and undeniable charisma creates exactly the kind of contrast that TV producers dream about. Put her next to Caitlin Clark, the generational talent, the quiet assassin, the woman the whole country started watching college basketball to see, and you have a dynamic that casual fans can immediately understand and emotionally invest in. Clark is the extraordinary gift. Cunningham is the electric personality who makes every situation more entertaining. Together, they're not just a basketball duo, they're a show. The reported tour model reinforces this logic completely. If you're staging high-profile events in London and Dubai and Tokyo, you're not selling to the average WNBA fan base. You're selling to a global audience that responds to star power, personality, and spectacle. Cunningham brings something to that formula that pure basketball credentials don't always deliver. She makes people feel something. Cameras gravitate toward her. Brands want her face. The internet loves her energy. For a new league trying to establish itself on a global stage in an extremely short window of time, that is not a small thing. That's actually the whole game. And here's what makes the pairing even more strategically clean. They reportedly get along. There's no manufactured tension, no awkward chemistry issue to paper over. The dynamic is genuine. And in the age of content and social media, genuine chemistry between two compelling personalities is worth more than almost any other asset a sports product can have. The Saudis, if these reports are accurate, didn't pick randomly. They picked with precision.
This is the part of the story that will be studied in sports business courses for the next 20 years, because the series of institutional failures that pushed Caitlin Clark towards this moment is almost too systematic to be accidental. From the second she was drafted first overall, the environment she walked into was hostile, not competitive, hostile. Diana Taurasi, a legend of the game, someone whose respect for the sport should have been unquestionable, issued what sounded less like a veteran's wisdom and more like a territorial warning during the Final Four. The message was clear: know your place. The old guard wasn't ready to hand over the narrative, even to someone who was objectively growing the sport they'd spent their careers building. Then the game started. What followed was a pattern that went beyond physical basketball. Clark was grabbed, pushed, hip-checked, and knocked to the floor in ways that referees consistently declined to call. The Kennedy Carter incident became a flashpoint because it was so visible and so blatant. A forearm to the back, a message sent in front of a national audience, and a league response so muted it might as well have been silence. Stephen A. Smith didn't stay silent. He erupted. He wanted to know where the protection was, where were the teammates, where was the institutional response from a league that was benefiting financially from her presence every single day.
The answer, it turned out, was nowhere. The WNBA's veteran culture had decided the dues needed to be paid, and they were going to make sure Clark paid every single one of them, publicly, repeatedly, and without apology. What they miscalculated was that this wasn't a normal rookie in a normal situation. This was someone with options, real options. Options that existed precisely because she'd made the league too valuable for other money not to show up. And those options had already come knocking once before. Ice Cube, the rapper and entrepreneur behind the Big 3 3-on-3 basketball league, made Clark a public offer of $5 million to play just 8 games. 8 games! $5 million. That's more than her entire 4-year WNBA contract. At the time, she turned it down. She wanted to compete at the highest level. She wanted to win a championship. She believed in the institution enough to take $76,000 a year instead of a $5 million check. That was before the hazing. That was before the unprotected hits, the commercial flights, the Olympic snub, and the deafening institutional silence every time something happened that should have triggered a response. The $5 million offer from Ice Cube looks like a footnote now, because what's reportedly on the table from the Saudis makes $5 million look like pocket change. And the woman who turned down pocket change in good faith has been given very little reason to extend that same good faith to the people who failed her. Let's zoom out and look at this from the perspective of the league's front office, because the situation they're currently sitting in is genuinely extraordinary in the worst possible way. The WNBA is in the middle of negotiating one of the most important media rights deals in its history. Disney, Amazon, and NBC are all reportedly at the table, and the numbers being discussed are in the billions. This would be transformational for the league, the kind of financial injection that could finally give it the infrastructure to pay players properly, improve travel conditions, and compete seriously for mainstream sports attention. But the entire pitch to those networks is built on one foundation, one name, one story, the Caitlin Clark effect. Every graph they're showing to media executives has a sharp upward curve that begins at the exact moment she was drafted. Every attendance record, every television rating milestone, every spike in merchandise revenue, it all traces back to the same source. She is the product they are selling to Disney and Amazon and NBC. Not the league, not the history, not the other players. Her. Now, imagine the moment she walks into a press conference and announces she's signing with a Saudi-backed global league. Imagine what happens to those negotiations in real time. The leverage the WNBA is relying on doesn't just weaken, it disappears completely. Networks aren't paying billions of dollars for women's basketball in the abstract. They're paying for the Caitlin Clark show, and if that show is moving to a different network, a different league, a different continent,
The deal dies with it. And here's the devastating irony that makes this entire situation almost poetic in its cruelty. The players who spent the last year and a half making Clark's life miserable, the veterans who hip-checked her, the teammates who stayed silent, the culture that tried to haze her into submission, they all have a stake in that media rights deal too. Their revenue sharing, their improved contracts, their financial future in the league is directly tied to the television deal that requires Clark's presence to exist. By undermining the one player who was pulling the money in, they may have pulled the chair out from under their own financial futures. Stephen A. Smith flagged this exact dynamic. You don't bite the hand that feeds you and expect the food to keep coming. The veterans who wanted to put Clark in her place may have, without fully understanding what they were doing, voted against their own paychecks. That is a specific kind of karma that the sports world does not often serve this cleanly. In sports, when a rumor is false and damaging, it gets killed quickly. Agents put out statements, players go on record, teams issue denials. The machinery of reputation management moves fast because careers and contracts depend on narrative control. That's not what's happening here. Caitlin Clark's representatives have not issued a denial. Sophie Cunningham's camp has been completely silent, and Stephen A. Smith, the man with the platform and the credibility to either validate or dismiss this entire story, is not dismissing it. He's feeding it. In sports media, that combination of silence and amplification from credible voices usually doesn't point toward nothing. It typically points toward something that isn't ready to be announced yet.
There are a few ways to read that silence. One possibility is that conversations are genuinely happening, and neither camp can say anything publicly while the season is ongoing and terms are still being worked through. Another possibility is that this is deliberate leverage, that the rumors are being allowed to breathe specifically because they strengthen Clark and Cunningham's negotiating position with the WNBA itself. If the league believes for even a moment that its most valuable player is seriously entertaining a Saudi offer, the pressure to restructure, to compensate properly, to create conditions that make leaving unattractive, that pressure becomes enormous. Either way, the silence is doing work. Whether it leads to a historic departure or a dramatic renegotiation, the fact that nobody is shooting this story down tells you everything about the state of play. The WNBA is not in control of this narrative, and in the current sports media landscape, losing narrative control is often the first step toward losing everything else. The timing adds another layer. The WNBA season is physically brutal. Travel is grueling, the schedule is relentless, and the gap between what these players endure and what they're compensated for enduring has never been more visible than it is right now. Every tough road trip, every cramped commercial flight, every moment where the infrastructure fails to match the talent on the floor, all of it makes the reported promise of private travel and billion-dollar backing feel less like a fantasy and more like a reasonable alternative. Fatigue has a way of clarifying priorities, and right now, the people who had the power to make Clark want to stay chose repeatedly to do the opposite. Here's where we land. The WNBA received something that sports leagues spend decades praying for, a player who transcends the sport, who brings in audiences that didn't previously exist, who makes the entire enterprise more valuable just by showing up. They received her at a moment when the league desperately needed exactly that kind of catalyst. And rather than wrapping infrastructure, protection, and fair compensation around her to make sure she never had a reason to look elsewhere, they allowed a culture of resentment to push her to the exits. The Saudi Public Investment Fund didn't create this problem. They just identified it, assigned a dollar figure to it, and reportedly made a call. That's what capital does when it sees an undervalued asset in a dysfunctional system. It moves. And the billion-dollar number attached to this story, whether it proves to be exactly accurate or somewhat different in its final form, tells you everything about the gap between what the WNBA valued Clark at and what the rest of the world understood her to actually be worth. The moral debate will come. It always does when Saudi money enters a sports conversation.
Critics will raise human rights records. The sports washing conversation will run its course through social media for a few weeks. But if LIV Golf and Ronaldo's Saudi move taught us anything, it's that fans follow the talent, not the institution. People will watch Caitlin Clark play basketball regardless of what banner she's playing under. The moral outrage has a shelf life, the generational talent does not. What's at stake right now isn't just one player's contract, it's the entire future of women's professional basketball in America. If Clark leaves, the WNBA survives, but it survives as a diminished version of what it was becoming. The television deal shrinks, the momentum stalls, the window that opened when she was drafted slowly closes again. And somewhere in a boardroom with a view that costs more than a WNBA career, a group of investors will be watching every moment of it, knowing they were right about the value of what the league threw away. The Sophie and Caitlin era of women's basketball might be coming. The question is simply which league gets to host it. Would you keep watching the WNBA if Clark and Cunningham walked, or would you follow them to whatever league signs them?